The rain hammered against the windows of the naval base like bullets from an automatic weapon. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell pressed her face against the cold glass, watching the palm trees bend impossibly far in the howling wind. Hurricane Delilah was supposed to miss them by at least 50 miles, but nature had other plans. The storm had turned at the last moment, its massive eye now bearing down directly on their coastal facility. Sarah had been through plenty of dangerous situations in her 3 years as a Navy SEAL candidate, but this felt different. This wasn't a mission where she could rely on her training, her team, or her equipment. This was raw, unstoppable nature, and it didn't care about her determination or her dreams of becoming the first woman to complete SEAL training at this particular base. The base commander, Admiral Richardson, had made the evacuation order clear 2 hours ago. All non-essential personnel were to evacuate immediately to the inland shelter facilities. Essential personnel would remain to secure critical equipment and maintain communications. Sarah wasn't on either list officially, but she had volunteered to stay behind with the skeleton crew. Her instructor, Chief Petty Officer Marcus Kane, had tried to talk her out of it. Kane was a 20-year veteran who had seen action in 3 different theaters of war. He was tough as nails and had made Sarah's life particularly difficult since she'd arrived at the training facility. Not because he had anything against women in the military, but because he believed the SEAL program wasn't meant for anyone who couldn't handle the absolute worst conditions imaginable. "Mitchell, you don't need to prove anything to anyone," Kane had said when she volunteered to stay. "This storm is going to be a monster. The smart play is to evacuate with the others and come back when it's over." But Sarah couldn't do that. She had spent months fighting for respect in a program that many believed she had no business being in. Every day was a battle to prove that she belonged, that she could keep up with the men, that she could handle whatever the military threw at her. Evacuating now, even though it was the smart thing to do, felt like giving up. The other SEAL candidates had already been evacuated earlier in the day. Sarah was the only trainee left on the base, along with about 30 essential personnel who would ride out the storm in the reinforced bunker complex beneath the main building. She had convinced Kane to let her stay by arguing that she could help with communications and equipment security. As she watched the storm intensify, Sarah thought about the conversation she'd had with her father just 2 days earlier. Colonel James Mitchell had served in the Army for 30 years and had always been supportive of his daughter's military career. But even he had expressed doubts about her SEAL ambitions. "Honey, I'm not saying you can't do it," he had said during their video call. "I'm just saying that maybe you don't have to do everything the hard way. There are other ways to serve, other ways to make a difference." Sarah had bristled at the suggestion. The hard way was the only way that mattered to her. She had grown up hearing stories about her grandfather, who had been a Navy frogman in World War II, the predecessor to the modern SEALs. She had always dreamed of following in his footsteps, of proving that courage and determination weren't limited by gender. The wind outside was getting stronger, and Sarah could see debris flying past the windows. Palm fronds, pieces of roofing, and what looked like a stop sign tumbled through the air like leaves. The base's emergency lighting system had already kicked in, bathing everything in an eerie red glow. Chief Kane appeared beside her at the window, his weathered face grim. "Time to head down to the bunker," he said. "The wind speed just hit 120 miles per hour, and it's still building. We've lost contact with the weather service, but the last report said this thing could hit Category 5 before it makes landfall." Sarah nodded and gathered her gear. She had packed light, just the essentials: her communications equipment, some extra batteries, water, and emergency rations. The bunker was designed to withstand anything nature could throw at it, including direct hits from tornadoes and hurricanes. It had been built during the Cold War to serve as a command center in case of nuclear attack, and it had been upgraded several times over the decades. As they made their way through the corridors toward the bunker entrance, Sarah could hear the building groaning under the pressure of the wind. The base was built to withstand hurricanes, but Delilah was testing those limits. Light fixtures swayed overhead, and she could hear things breaking somewhere in the distance. The bunker entrance was in the basement of the main administrative building. They had to use their keycards and enter special codes to get through the multiple security doors. The final door was made of steel and was nearly a foot thick. Once it closed behind them, the sound of the storm became muffled and distant. The bunker itself was surprisingly spacious. It contained a command center with multiple computer terminals and communication equipment, sleeping quarters for up to 50 people, a kitchen and dining area, medical facilities, and enough supplies to last for weeks if necessary. The air was recycled through a sophisticated filtration system, and backup generators provided power independent of the main base electrical grid. Most of the 30 people who had stayed behind were already in the bunker when Sarah and Kane arrived. She recognized some of them: Lieutenant Commander Janet Walsh from Communications, Petty Officer Rodriguez from Maintenance, and several others from various departments. They all had essential skills that might be needed during or after the storm. Admiral Richardson was there too, which surprised Sarah. As base commander, he could have easily justified evacuating with the non-essential personnel. Instead, he had chosen to stay with his people. He was in his mid-50s, with gray hair, and the kind of commanding presence that made people listen when he spoke. "All right, everyone," the Admiral said as Kane and Sarah joined the group. "We're going to be here for at least 12 hours, maybe longer. The storm is moving slower than originally predicted, which means we're going to take a beating for an extended period. Our job is to monitor the situation, maintain communications with the mainland as long as possible, and assess damage so we can begin recovery operations as soon as it's safe." He gestured to the communication equipment. "Lieutenant Commander Walsh will coordinate with emergency services and keep track of the storm's progress. Petty Officer Rodriguez will monitor the base infrastructure and keep our backup systems running. The rest of you will assist as needed and be ready to respond to emergencies." Sarah found herself assigned to help with communications. It wasn't the most exciting job, but it was important, and it gave her something to focus on besides the storm raging overhead. She settled in at one of the radio stations and began monitoring emergency frequencies. For the first few hours, everything went smoothly. The bunker's systems worked perfectly, and they maintained contact with the mainland emergency coordination center. Reports came in regularly about the storm's progress and intensity. Delilah had indeed reached Category 5 status, with sustained winds of over 160 miles per hour. Sarah listened to radio chatter from other military installations in the area. Some were reporting significant damage, including collapsed buildings and flooding. The storm surge was expected to reach heights of over 20 feet in some areas, which would put parts of their own base underwater. Around midnight, things started to go wrong. The first sign of trouble was a power fluctuation that caused several computer terminals to shut down and restart. Rodriguez immediately went to check the generators, while Walsh worked to restore communications that had been temporarily disrupted. "Generator 2 is showing signs of stress," Rodriguez reported over the intercom. "The storm is putting more pressure on our systems than we anticipated. I'm switching to backup protocols." Sarah continued monitoring the radio frequencies, but the signals were getting weaker and more distorted as the storm intensified. She could hear voices calling for help, reporting emergencies, but many of the transmissions were breaking up or cutting out entirely. Then, at approximately 1:30 a.m., everything went silent. The lights went out, plunging the bunker into complete darkness. Emergency lighting kicked in a few seconds later, but it was dim and cast everything in an ominous red glow. All of the computer terminals had shut down, and the radio equipment was dead. "Rodriguez, report," Admiral Richardson called out. There was no response over the intercom system. Kane immediately grabbed a flashlight and headed for the generator room, which was located in a separate section of the bunker complex. Sarah and several others followed him through the narrow corridors, their footsteps echoing in the confined space. They found Rodriguez unconscious on the floor of the generator room. Both main generators had shut down, and there was a strong smell of electrical burning in the air. Kane immediately checked Rodriguez's pulse while Sarah examined the generator control panels. "He's alive, just knocked out," Kane reported. "Looks like he might have been hit by electrical feedback when the generators failed." Sarah studied the control panels, trying to make sense of the complex array of switches, gauges, and warning lights. She had some training in electrical systems, but nothing this sophisticated. The main problem seemed to be that water had somehow gotten into the electrical connections, causing multiple short circuits and safety shutdowns. "The storm surge must be higher than expected," she said. "Water is getting into systems that were supposed to be completely sealed." They managed to get Rodriguez conscious and back to the main bunker area, where the medical personnel could check him over. He had a mild concussion and some electrical burns on his hands, but he was coherent enough to explain what had happened. "The whole electrical system is compromised," he said weakly. "Water got into the main junction box somehow. I was trying to reroute power when everything went haywire. The safety systems shut everything down to prevent a fire or explosion." Admiral Richardson gathered everyone in the main area to assess their situation. Without power, they had lost communications, ventilation, lighting, and most of their monitoring equipment. The emergency lighting would last for maybe 12 hours on battery power. After that, they would be in complete darkness. How long until the storm passes? Kane asked. Lieutenant Commander Walsh checked her watch and did some quick calculations. Based on the last weather report we received, we're probably only about halfway through. The eye wall hasn't even reached us yet. We could be looking at another 8 to 10 hours of intense conditions. The reality of their situation was starting to sink in. They were trapped underground in a disabled bunker while a Category 5 hurricane raged overhead. They had no way to communicate with the outside world, no way to call for help, and no way to know what was happening on the surface. Sarah found herself thinking about Chief Kane's words from earlier. Maybe the smart play really had been to evacuate with the others. Maybe staying behind to prove a point wasn't worth risking her life and the lives of everyone else in the bunker. But it was too late for second thoughts now. They were committed to riding out the storm, and they would have to make the best of their situation. Sarah volunteered to help Rodriguez assess the damage to the electrical systems, hoping that her engineering training might be useful. Working by flashlight, they made their way back to the generator room and the main electrical control center. The damage was extensive. Salt water had somehow penetrated the supposedly waterproof seals and had corroded or short-circuited most of the critical components. Even if they could get the generators running again, the distribution system was too damaged to safely carry power. This is bad, Rodriguez admitted. Even with perfect conditions and a full repair crew, this would take days to fix properly. With what we have here, in the middle of a hurricane, he shook his head. Sarah studied the damaged equipment, her mind racing through possible solutions. There had to be something they could do, some way to restore at least minimal power and communications. The lives of everyone in the bunker might depend on it. As if to emphasize the urgency of their situation, the building above them let out a tremendous groan, followed by what sounded like something massive crashing down. The storm was tearing the base apart piece by piece, and they were running out of time. The emergency lighting flickered, a reminder that their battery power was finite. Soon, they would be in complete darkness, cut off from the world above and at the mercy of whatever Hurricane Delilah had in store for them. Sarah looked around at the faces of her fellow service members, illuminated by the red emergency lights. Some showed fear, others determination, but all of them were looking to their leaders for guidance and hope. She realized that this was exactly the kind of situation that SEALs trained for. The impossible scenario where everything goes wrong, and you have to find a way to survive through sheer determination and ingenuity. Maybe this was her chance to prove that she belonged after all, not by lifting the heaviest weights or running the fastest times, but by helping to solve an impossible problem when lives depended on it. The storm continued to rage overhead, but Sarah Mitchell was no longer thinking about evacuation or playing it safe. She was thinking about survival, about leadership, and about proving that sometimes the only way out of an impossible situation is straight through the middle of it. The emergency lighting died at 3:47 a.m., plunging the bunker into absolute darkness. Sarah had been watching the battery indicator slowly drop for the past hour, knowing this moment was inevitable, but still feeling her stomach clench when it finally happened. Around her, she could hear 30 people breathing in the pitch black, the sound somehow both comforting and terrifying. "Everyone stay calm." Admiral Richardson's voice cut through the darkness, steady and authoritative. "We knew this was going to happen. Chief Kane, do we have the emergency flashlights distributed?" "Yes, sir." Kane's voice came from somewhere to Sarah's left. "Everyone should have received one flashlight and fresh batteries. Use them sparingly. We don't know how long we're going to be down here." Sarah fumbled for her flashlight and clicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness like a sword. Around her, other lights began appearing as people found their equipment. The bunker, which had seemed spacious and comfortable just a few hours ago, now felt cramped and claustrophobic in the limited circles of light. Above them, Hurricane Delilah continued its assault on the base. Even through the reinforced concrete and steel of the bunker, they could hear the storm's fury. It sounded like a freight train that never stopped, punctuated by crashes and bangs as pieces of the base were torn apart and hurled around by the wind. Sarah had spent the last 2 hours working with Rodriguez and a few others, trying to find a way to restore power to at least some of the bunker's systems. They had managed to trace most of the electrical damage, but the saltwater intrusion was more extensive than anyone had realized. The storm surge had somehow found its way into systems that were supposed to be completely sealed, corroding connections and short-circuiting critical components. The main problem is the switching station, Rodriguez had explained, his voice strained from pain and exhaustion. The electrical burns on his hands were getting worse, and the medical team was concerned about infection. Even if we could get one of the generators running, we can't safely distribute power without fixing that first. And to fix it, we need parts we don't have and equipment we can't access. But Sarah had an idea that she'd been reluctant to share because it sounded crazy even to her. The bunker's communication systems were designed to work independently of the main power grid, with their own dedicated generator and power distribution system. If they could somehow tap into that system and reroute power, they might be able to restore life support and basic communications. The catch was that the communication system's generator was located in a separate building on the surface, connected to the bunker through a series of underground cables and conduits. To access it, someone would have to leave the safety of the bunker and venture out into the hurricane. Sarah had been a competitive swimmer in college before joining the military. She had grown up in Florida and had experienced several hurricanes, though never one this powerful. She understood the dangers of moving around in hurricane-force winds, but she also knew that sometimes desperate situations required desperate measures. She decided to talk to Chief Kane about her idea privately before bringing it to Admiral Richardson. Kane had been her toughest instructor, but she had come to respect his judgment and his experience. If anyone could evaluate the feasibility of her plan, it would be him. She found Kane sitting near the medical station, where Rodriguez was being treated for his injuries. Kane looked up as she approached, his weathered face grim in the flashlight beam. "What's on your mind, Mitchell?" he asked quietly. Sarah explained her idea about accessing the communications generator, outlining the technical aspects first, and then acknowledging the obvious dangers. Kane listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. "You're talking about going outside in the middle of a Category 5 hurricane," he said when she finished. "The sustained winds are probably over 160 miles per hour right now, with gusts even higher. The storm surge has flooded most of the ground-level facilities. You could be killed instantly by flying debris or swept away by the water." "I know the risks," Sarah said, "but we're going to lose life support in this bunker within the next few hours if we can't restore power. The air recycling system is already starting to fail. In a few more hours, the carbon dioxide levels are going to become dangerous. And without communications, no one on the mainland even knows we're in trouble." Kane was quiet for a long moment, considering her words. "Even if you could somehow make it to the communications building alive, how would you get back? And how do you know the generator there is even still functional? The whole building could be underwater or destroyed by now." "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "But I think we have to try. What's the alternative? We sit here in the dark and hope the storm passes before we run out of breathable air." Before Kane could respond, Lieutenant Commander Walsh appeared beside them, her face pale in the flashlight beam. "We need to talk to the Admiral," she said urgently. "I've been monitoring the emergency radio frequencies with one of the battery-powered units. There are reports of massive storm surge flooding throughout the area. Some locations are reporting water levels 25 feet above normal." Sarah felt her heart sink. If the storm surge was that high, then the communications building on the surface was almost certainly underwater. Her plan to restore power might be impossible after all. They made their way to where Admiral Richardson was coordinating with the senior staff. The Admiral looked tired but alert, his gray hair disheveled, and his uniform wrinkled from hours in the bunker. "What's the situation, Walsh?" he asked. "Sir, the storm surge is much higher than predicted. We're getting reports of catastrophic flooding throughout the region. Our base is probably completely underwater at ground level right now." Admiral Richardson absorbed this information with the stoic calm of a career military officer. "What about our situation here in the bunker? How long can we maintain life support without power?" Lieutenant Commander Walsh consulted her notes. "The air recycling system failed about an hour ago when the power went out. We have enough oxygen for maybe 6 more hours, assuming normal breathing rates. But if people start to panic or exert themselves, it could be much less. And no chance of restoring power to the life support systems." Rodriguez, despite his injuries, tried to sit up straighter. "Sir, the electrical damage is too extensive. We need specialized equipment and replacement parts that we just don't have access to." Sarah took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Admiral, I may have an idea." She explained her plan about accessing the communications generator, acknowledging the risks but emphasizing that it might be their only chance. Admiral Richardson listened carefully, asking detailed questions about the technical aspects and the logistics of getting to the surface building. The communications building is about 200 yards from here, he said thoughtfully. Even if the ground level is flooded, the building itself is on elevated foundations. The generator room might still be accessible. Sir, with respect, this is suicide, Kane interjected. We're talking about sending someone out in conditions that would challenge a Category 5 Hurricane Hunter aircraft. The winds alone could kill her instantly. What about using safety lines? Sarah suggested. We could rig a rope system between here and the communications building. Even if I got knocked down or disoriented, I could follow the rope back. Walsh shook her head. The distance is too great, and we don't have that much rope. Besides, anything we put on the surface right now is going to be destroyed by the wind and debris. For several minutes, they debated alternatives and contingencies. Some suggested waiting for the eye of the storm to pass over them, which would provide a temporary lull in the wind and rain. Others argued for rationing their remaining air and hoping that rescue teams would find them after the storm passed. But Sarah could see the math as clearly as everyone else. They were running out of time and options. The air in the bunker was already starting to feel stale and warm. People were beginning to show signs of stress and claustrophobia. If they didn't act soon, panic would set in, which would only accelerate their consumption of the remaining oxygen. I volunteer to go, Sarah said firmly. I've been studying the bunker schematics and the electrical systems. I know exactly what needs to be done if the communications generator is still functional, and I have the most experience with emergency swimming and water survival. Mitchell, you don't have to prove anything, Kane said, echoing his words from earlier in the day. This isn't about SEAL training or gender equality. This is about staying alive. That's exactly why I have to go, Sarah replied. Because staying alive might require someone to take a calculated risk. And, right now, I'm the person best qualified to take that risk. Admiral Richardson studied her face in the dim flashlight beam. What would you need? Sarah had already been thinking about the equipment and supplies she would require. A diving mask to protect my eyes from the wind and rain. Some kind of flotation device in case I have to swim through floodwater. A waterproof flashlight. Tools to work on the generator. And a radio so I can communicate back to the bunker if I make it to the building. The radio won't work, Walsh pointed out. Our communication systems are down, remember? The emergency radio frequencies should still work if I can get close enough, Sarah said. Besides, if I can restore power to the communications building, I should be able to re-establish contact with the mainland emergency services. They spent the next hour planning the mission in detail. The bunker had emergency exit points that led to the surface through armored stairwells. Sarah would use the exit closest to the communications building, though even that would require her to travel across nearly 200 yards of open ground in hurricane conditions. The medical team prepared a small first aid kit that she could carry, and the maintenance crew gathered the tools she might need to work on the generator. Kane insisted on giving her a diving knife and an emergency whistle, though he admitted grimly that they probably wouldn't do her much good if she got into real trouble. As they made final preparations, Sarah found herself thinking about her family back home. Her parents had no idea she was in danger. They probably assumed she had evacuated with the other non-essential personnel. Her father would be angry when he found out she had volunteered to stay behind, and even angrier when he learned about her plan to venture out into the hurricane. But Sarah also thought about the 30 people trapped in the bunker with her. They were depending on her, whether they wanted to admit it or not. She was possibly their only chance of survival, and that responsibility felt heavier than any physical challenge she had faced in SEAL training. At 5:15 a.m., with the first gray hints of dawn beginning to show through the storm, Sarah stood at the bottom of the emergency exit stairwell. She had put on every piece of protective gear they could find: a diving mask, a life vest, waterproof boots, and a heavy rain jacket. She carried the tools and radio in a waterproof bag strapped to her back. Admiral Richardson, Kane, and several others had come to see her off. In the dim light of their flashlights, their faces showed a mixture of admiration, fear, and desperate hope. Remember, you don't have to be a hero, Kane said as he checked her equipment one final time. If you get out there, and the conditions are impossible, come back. We'll find another way. Sarah nodded, though they both knew there might not be another way. I'll be back in 2 hours, one way or another. Admiral Richardson shook her hand formally. Godspeed, Lieutenant. We'll be monitoring the emergency frequencies. Sarah began climbing the stairs toward the surface. each step taking her closer to the fury of Hurricane Delilah. Behind her, she could hear the heavy steel doors sealing shut, cutting off her retreat to the safety of the bunker. As she reached the top of the stairwell, she could hear the storm more clearly than ever before. It sounded like the end of the world was happening just beyond the final door. The entire stairwell shook with each powerful gust of wind, and she could hear debris impacting the armored entrance like artillery shells. Sarah took a deep breath of the stale air and reached for the door handle. On the other side lay either salvation or death, and there was only one way to find out which one it would be. The storm was waiting for her. The emergency exit door opened outward, which meant Sarah had to fight against the hurricane-force winds just to get it open wide enough to slip through. The moment she stepped outside, she understood just how much the bunker had been protecting them from the storm's full fury. The wind hit her like a physical blow, nearly knocking her off her feet despite the protective gear and her low center of gravity. The world above ground was unrecognizable. Where there had once been neat rows of military buildings, perfectly maintained lawns, and orderly parking areas, there was now a landscape of destruction that looked like a war zone. Most of the smaller buildings had been completely destroyed, reduced to scattered debris that whipped through the air like deadly projectiles. The larger structures that remained standing were missing roofs, walls, or entire sections. But the most shocking change was the water. The entire base was flooded, with dark, churning water that reached nearly to Sarah's chest in some areas and swirled with dangerous currents. Palm trees, pieces of buildings, vehicles, and other debris floated past her like a nightmarish parade. The storm surge had turned the military base into a temporary lake, and Hurricane Delilah was still stirring it with winds that felt strong enough to move mountains. Sarah had to move quickly, but carefully. The communications building was visible in the distance, its concrete structure still mostly intact, though clearly damaged. Between her and the building lay 200 yards of flooded terrain filled with floating hazards and punishing winds that threatened to knock her down with every step. She had planned to move along the edge of the larger buildings, using them as windbreaks when possible. But the flooding made this strategy more complicated than she had anticipated. In some areas, the water was deep enough that she had to swim, fighting not just the current, but the debris that could easily injure or kill her if she wasn't careful. The diving mask protected her eyes from the worst of the rain and wind, but it also limited her peripheral vision. Several times she had to duck or dodge pieces of debris that she saw at the last second. A stop sign tumbled past her head, followed by what looked like part of a roof. The air was full of so much flying material that it was like trying to navigate through a horizontal hailstorm made of building materials. 20 yards from the emergency exit, Sarah encountered her first major obstacle. A large section of prefabricated building had come to rest across her intended path, creating a barrier that was too high to climb over and too dangerous to go around. The twisted metal and concrete debris created a dam that forced the floodwater into a narrow channel with a powerful current. Sarah studied the obstacle, trying to calculate the risks of different approaches. She could try to swim through the narrow channel, but the current was strong enough that it might sweep her away from her intended direction. She could attempt to climb over the debris, but the wind was strong enough that it might blow her off once she was exposed on top. She decided to try a combination approach. Moving carefully along the edge of the debris pile, she found a spot where the structure created a partial windbreak. Using pieces of rebar and concrete chunks as handholds, she began working her way up and over the obstacle. Halfway across, a particularly powerful gust of wind caught her and nearly tore her loose from her grip. For a terrifying moment, she hung suspended over the churning water below, her hands burning as she fought to maintain her hold on the sharp metal. Her waterproof bag caught the wind like a sail, adding to the force trying to rip her away from the debris. But her training kicked in. Sarah had spent countless hours in SEAL preparation courses learning to maintain control of her body under extreme stress. She forced herself to breathe steadily, to focus on one handhold at a time, to ignore the voice in her head that was screaming about the impossibility of what she was trying to do. She made it over the debris and dropped back into the chest-deep water on the other side. The communications building was now only about 100 yards away, but those 100 yards included the most open ground of her entire journey. There would be no shelter from the wind, and the water appeared to be even deeper in that area. As she waded and swam toward the building, Sarah began to notice that the storm's intensity was fluctuating. The wind would build to an absolutely overwhelming crescendo, then back off slightly before building again. She realized she might be approaching the eye wall of the hurricane, the ring of the most intense winds that surrounded the calm center of the storm. If that was true, then she might have a brief window of calmer conditions once the eye passed over. But she also knew that the eye wall itself contained the most dangerous winds in the entire hurricane system. She needed to reach the communications building before those winds arrived, or she might not survive the crossing. The last 50 yards were the worst. The water was deep enough that Sarah had to swim most of the distance, fighting not just the current, but the waves created by the wind. Debris in the water posed a constant threat, and she had to constantly change direction to avoid floating hazards. A military vehicle of some kind drifted past her, completely submerged except for its antenna. She reached the communications building just as the wind began to increase to levels that seemed impossible. The structure was built like a fortress, with reinforced concrete walls and minimal windows. But even this solid building was showing signs of damage. Parts of the roof had been torn away, and one of the walls had a large crack running from top to bottom. The main entrance was underwater, but Sarah remembered from the building schematics that there was a maintenance access point on the elevated side. She worked her way around the building, using the structure itself as protection from the worst of the wind, until she found the access door. The door was locked, but the frame had been damaged by flying debris. Sarah used the diving knife Kane had given her to pry at the weakened frame until she could force the door open. She squeezed through the gap and found herself in a maintenance corridor that was dark but dry. Her waterproof flashlight revealed a narrow hallway that led toward the generator room. Emergency signs on the walls, though partially damaged, still pointed the way. Sarah moved quickly through the building, aware that every minute she spent inside was a minute closer to the arrival of the eye wall winds. The generator room was located in the basement level of the building, which meant it was likely flooded. Sarah made her way down a concrete stairwell, her flashlight beam revealing rising water levels with each step. By the time she reached the bottom, the water was up to her waist and still rising. But the generator itself was mounted on an elevated platform, and the control panel was still above the water line. Sarah waded through the flooded basement, hoping that the electrical components hadn't been damaged by moisture or spray. The generator was a massive diesel unit, designed to provide backup power for the entire communications complex. She found the control panel and began working through the startup sequence she had memorized from the technical manuals. The first step was to check the fuel levels and oil pressure. Both appeared to be adequate, though she couldn't be sure about the condition of the fuel after hours of storm conditions. The next step was to test the electrical connections. This was where Sarah held her breath, because water damage to the electrical system would make the entire mission pointless. She activated the diagnostic routine and watched as lights began appearing on the control panel. Green lights indicated normal operation. Yellow lights indicated minor issues that wouldn't prevent startup. Red lights indicated critical problems that would shut down the system. The panel lit up like a Christmas tree, showing a mixture of all three colors. There were definitely problems, but nothing that appeared to be immediately critical. Sarah made the decision to attempt startup, knowing that this might be their only chance. She initiated the startup sequence and heard the generator cough to life. The diesel engine turned over several times before catching, then settled into the steady rumble that indicated normal operation. The electrical output gauges showed power generation within acceptable parameters. But Sarah's relief was short-lived. She could hear the wind outside increasing to levels that defied belief. The entire building was shaking with each gust, and she could hear debris impacting the walls like artillery fire. The eye wall was arriving, and she was trapped in a basement that was rapidly filling with water. She activated the communication systems from the generator control panel, hoping to establish contact with either the bunker or the mainland emergency services. The radio equipment came online, and she immediately began broadcasting on emergency frequencies. Mayday, Mayday, this is Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell at Naval Training Facility Bravo. We have 30 personnel trapped in underground bunker with life support failure, requesting immediate assistance when weather conditions permit. Hurricane Delilah has caused catastrophic damage to base facilities. She repeated the message several times, but heard no response. Either her signals weren't getting through the storm, or there was no one in position to receive them. But at least the communication systems were now functioning, which meant that rescue teams might be able to contact them once the hurricane passed. The water level in the generator room was continuing to rise, and Sarah realized she needed to get back to higher ground. But When she tried to make her way back up the stairwell, she found her path blocked by debris that had been blown into the building through damaged sections of the roof. She was trapped in a flooding basement while the most dangerous part of the hurricane passed overhead. The generator continued to run, providing power to the communications equipment, but Sarah wasn't sure she would live long enough to see anyone benefit from her success. The water was now up to her chest, and electrical equipment was beginning to spark and short-circuit as it was submerged. Sarah found a maintenance ladder that led to a higher level of the building and climbed up, hoping to find another way out. But as she reached the upper level, she could hear something that made her heart race with a different kind of fear. The wind outside was beginning to diminish, and she could see patches of sky through the damaged roof. The eye wall was passing, which meant the eye of the hurricane was approaching. In the eye of a Category 5 hurricane, the winds would drop to almost nothing for a period of time that could last anywhere from a few minutes to over an hour. It would be her best chance to make it back to the bunker alive, but it would also be her only chance. Once the eye passed and the backside of the storm arrived, the conditions would be just as dangerous as they had been on the front side. Sarah checked her watch. She had been away from the bunker for over an hour. The people trapped below ground would be getting desperate about their air supply. If she was going to make it back with news of her success, she needed to move during the eye passage. She made her way back through the building, looking for an exit that would give her the most direct path back to the bunker. The main entrance was still underwater, but an emergency exit on the second floor opened onto what had once been a loading dock. The platform was now like a small island in the middle of the flood. As she waited for the eye to arrive, Sarah continued broadcasting her Mayday message, hoping that someone, somewhere, might be listening. She also tried to contact the bunker directly, but the underground facility's communication equipment was still down. Then, suddenly, the wind stopped. Not diminished, not reduced, stopped completely. The silence was so profound after hours of hurricane-force winds that it felt unnatural, almost sinister. Sarah looked up through the damaged roof and saw stars. Actual stars, clearly visible in a circle of calm sky surrounded by towering walls of clouds. She was in the eye of Hurricane Delilah, and she had perhaps 30 minutes to make it back to the bunker before the backside of the storm arrived with renewed fury. Sarah gathered her equipment, said a quick prayer, and prepared to make the most important sprint of her life. The journey back would be just as dangerous as the journey to the communications building, but now she was carrying the weight of success along with the burden of getting that success back to the people who needed it most. The eye of the hurricane was beautiful and terrifying at the same time, and Sarah Mitchell was about to bet her life that she could cross it before the walls came crashing down around her again. The silence in the eye of the hurricane was more unsettling than the howling winds had been. Sarah stood on the loading dock platform of the communications building, surrounded by an alien landscape of destruction bathed in ethereal starlight. The flood waters, which had been churning and violent just minutes before, now lay nearly still, reflecting the stars above like a massive mirror broken only by the dark shapes of floating debris. She had perhaps 30 minutes before the back wall of the hurricane arrived. 30 minutes to cross 200 yards of flooded, debris-filled terrain and get back to the safety of the bunker. It should have been easily manageable, except for the obstacles that had been created by hours of Category 5 winds, and the knowledge that one mistake could leave her stranded on the surface when the second half of the storm arrived. Sarah dropped from the loading dock into the chest-deep water, immediately feeling the difference in conditions. Without the driving wind, swimming was much easier, but the water was still cold and filled with hazardous debris. She began moving toward the bunker, using a steady breaststroke that allowed her to keep her head up and watch for obstacles. The landscape she was traversing looked like the surface of an alien planet. Building foundations emerged from the water like geometric islands. Vehicles sat submerged in random locations where the storm surge had deposited them. Trees that had stood for decades were gone entirely, leaving only scattered stumps and root systems. Power lines hung in tangled masses, some still sparking intermittently as water and electricity created dangerous combinations. About 50 yards from the communications building, Sarah encountered a new challenge that hadn't been there during her outbound journey. The storm had shifted a large section of destroyed building, creating a debris field that blocked her most direct path back to the bunker. She would have to detour around it, adding precious time to her journey. As she swam around the obstacle, Sarah became aware of sounds in the unnatural quiet of the eye. There were voices somewhere in the distance, faint but definitely human. Someone else was moving around on the surface, but she couldn't tell if they were friend or foe. In the aftermath of a disaster like this, there was always the possibility of looters or people taking advantage of the chaos. She decided to investigate, swimming quietly toward the source of the voices. What she found surprised her. A small group of people had taken shelter in the partially collapsed recreation center, about 100 yards from the bunker entrance. They appeared to be civilians, possibly base dependents who hadn't been evacuated in time. Sarah changed course and swam toward the recreation center. As she got closer, she could see that the group included at least 2 children and an elderly person. They were huddled together in what remained of the building, clearly frightened and probably injured. "Hello," she called out as she approached. "I'm Lieutenant Mitchell, U.S. Navy. Are you hurt?" One of the adults, a woman in her 40s, looked up with relief and desperation. "Thank God. We've been trapped here since the storm started. My husband was injured when part of the roof collapsed. We couldn't get to the evacuation point." Sarah quickly assessed the situation. The man was conscious but appeared to have a serious leg injury. The elderly person was showing signs of hypothermia from prolonged exposure to cold water. The children looked terrified but uninjured. "How many of you are there?" Sarah asked. "5 total," the woman replied. "Can you get us out of here? We heard on a battery radio that the eye is only supposed to last about 20 minutes. Sarah's mind raced through the options. She could guide the group back to the bunker, but that would mean revealing the location of their shelter to civilians. Military protocol generally prohibited bringing unauthorized personnel into secure facilities during emergencies. But she also couldn't abandon injured people, especially children, to face the second half of the hurricane alone. "I can get you to safety," she said, making a command decision that would probably violate several regulations. "But we need to move fast, and you need to follow my instructions exactly. The backside of this storm is going to be just as bad as the front side." She helped the injured man into a makeshift flotation device created from debris and life preservers they found in the recreation center. The elderly person, a woman in her 70s, was weak but mobile. The children, a boy and girl who looked to be about 8 and 10 years old, were scared but able to swim short distances. "We're going to move as a group," Sarah explained. "I'll lead the way and help anyone who gets into trouble. But we have to keep moving. If we get caught on the surface when the back wall hits, we might not survive." The journey back to the bunker with 5 additional people was far more challenging than Sarah had anticipated. The injured man needed constant assistance, and the elderly woman tired quickly in the cold water. The children did their best to keep up, but they were frightened and exhausted. Sarah found herself switching between roles as navigator, lifeguard, and military leader. She guided the group around the worst obstacles, helped people when they faltered in the water, and constantly monitored the sky for signs that the eye was ending. Above them, the circular wall of clouds seemed to be rotating slowly, a reminder that they were in the center of a massive atmospheric machine. They were about halfway to the bunker when Sarah heard the first sounds that indicated their time was running out. Far in the distance, she could hear the roar of returning winds as the back wall of the hurricane approached. The eye was moving past them, and they had perhaps 10 minutes before they would be engulfed in Category 5 conditions again. "We need to move faster," she told the group urgently. "The storm is coming back." But the injured man was slowing them down significantly, and the elderly woman was showing signs of exhaustion that worried Sarah. She made another command decision, one that went against every instinct about not leaving people behind. "I'm going to get help," she announced. "There's a shelter very close to here. I can get people who can assist with the injured. But I need everyone to wait here and not try to move without me." She left the group taking shelter behind a partially submerged vehicle and swam as fast as she could toward the bunker entrance. The emergency exit was still accessible, though the water level had risen even higher during her absence. She pounded on the door, hoping that someone was monitoring the entrance. Chief Kane opened the door, his face showing a mixture of relief and concern when he saw her. "Mitchell, we'd given up hope. Are you all right?" "I'm fine, but we have a situation," Sarah said quickly. "I found 5 civilians trapped on the surface, including 2 children and an injured man. I need help getting them to safety before the back wall hits." Kane's expression changed. "Bringing civilians into the bunker violates security protocols, and we don't have authorization." "Chief, there are children out there," Sarah interrupted. "I'm not leaving kids to die because of protocol." Kane studied her face for a moment, then nodded grimly. "You're right. How much time do we have?" "Maybe 5 minutes before the winds return. less if we're unlucky. Kane quickly organized a rescue team of 4 volunteers, including himself. They gathered flotation devices and emergency medical supplies, then followed Sarah back to where she had left the civilians. The wind was already starting to pick up, and they could all hear the approaching roar of the hurricane's back wall. The rescue of the civilian family became a race against time that tested everyone's limits. The injured man had to be carried through the water on an improvised stretcher. The elderly woman needed constant assistance. The children were exhausted and frightened, clinging to their rescuers as the wind began to howl around them again. They reached the bunker entrance just as the first major gusts of the returning hurricane began to batter the area. Sarah was the last person through the emergency door, and she could feel the suction of the wind trying to pull her back out as Kane and the others dragged the heavy steel door closed behind her. As they made their way down the stairwell to the bunker proper, Sarah realized that she had accomplished far more than just restoring power to the communications systems. She had also saved 5 lives and proven something important to herself and to everyone else in the bunker. Admiral Richardson was waiting for them in the main area, along with the medical team that immediately began treating the injured civilians. The Admiral's expression was unreadable as he surveyed the group of wet, exhausted people who had just emerged from the hurricane's eye. "Lieutenant Mitchell," he said formally, "I understand you were successful in restoring communications." "Yes, sir," Sarah replied. "The generator is running, and I was able to broadcast a Mayday message. I'm not sure if anyone received it, but the equipment is functional and ready for rescue coordination when the storm passes. And you also took it upon yourself to conduct a rescue operation," the Admiral continued. Sarah straightened, preparing for disciplinary action. "Yes, sir. I encountered civilians in distress and made a judgment call about their safety." Admiral Richardson looked at her for a long moment, then at the civilians who were receiving medical treatment nearby. The children had stopped crying and were beginning to warm up in the heated bunker. The injured man's leg was being properly splinted for the first time in hours. The elderly woman was wrapped in blankets and sipping hot broth. "You violated protocol by bringing unauthorized personnel into a secure facility during an emergency," the Admiral said. "Yes, sir, I did. You also extended your time on the surface beyond mission parameters, putting yourself and the rescue team at additional risk." "Yes, sir." Admiral Richardson's stern expression softened slightly. "You also saved 5 lives, including 2 children, while successfully completing a mission that may well save the lives of everyone in this bunker." He extended his hand to Sarah. "Outstanding work, Lieutenant. That's exactly the kind of judgment and leadership we need in the SEAL program." As Sarah shook the Admiral's hand, she realized that she had passed a test she hadn't even known she was taking. This wasn't about physical strength or endurance or following orders blindly. It was about making the right decision under impossible circumstances, about leading by example when lives were on the line. Outside, Hurricane Delilah continued to rage, but inside the bunker, 35 people were safe and secure, with restored communications and renewed hope for rescue. Sarah Mitchell had walked into the storm as a SEAL candidate trying to prove herself. She was walking out of it as a leader who had already proven everything that mattered. But the hurricane wasn't over yet, and neither was her test. The backside of the storm would bring its own challenges, and Sarah would need to help lead the group through whatever came next. The hardest part of surviving a disaster, she was beginning to realize, wasn't the immediate danger. It was everything that came after. The back wall of Hurricane Delilah hit the base with a fury that seemed even more intense than the front side of the storm. In the bunker, 35 people listened to the renewed assault on the world above them. But now they had working life support systems, functional communications, and something they hadn't possessed hours earlier: hope. Sarah found herself in an unexpected position of leadership as they waited out the storm. Admiral Richardson had officially put her in charge of coordinating with external rescue services once radio contact could be established. It was a role that would have been unthinkable for a SEAL trainee just 24 hours earlier. But everything had changed during her journey through the hurricane's eye. The communications equipment that Sarah had restored was functioning perfectly, but establishing contact with the outside world proved challenging. The second half of the hurricane was interfering with radio signals just as much as the first half had. Sarah spent hours trying different frequencies and transmission patterns, occasionally catching fragments of distant voices but unable to maintain clear communication. During this time, she got to know the civilian family she had rescued. The woman, Janet Reynolds, was the wife of a Navy contractor who worked on base. Her husband Mark was the one with the injured leg, and he turned out to be an electrical engineer who had been helping with bunker maintenance when the storm hit. The elderly woman was Janet's mother, visiting from Ohio and experiencing her first hurricane. The children, Emma and Jake, were remarkably resilient considering what they had been through. "I can't believe you went out there by yourself," Janet said to Sarah as they sat together monitoring the radio equipment. "When we saw you swimming toward our building, it was like seeing an angel." Sarah felt uncomfortable with the praise, but she was learning to accept it gracefully. "I was trained for this kind of situation. You would have done the same thing if you had the skills and equipment." "I don't think so," Janet replied honestly. "I would have been too scared." What Sarah was beginning to understand was that courage wasn't about not being scared. It was about acting despite being scared. She had been terrified every moment she was on the surface, but she had pushed through that fear because people's lives depended on her actions. Around noon on the day after the hurricane began, nearly 18 hours after Sarah's rescue mission, she finally managed to establish clear radio contact with the Coast Guard Emergency Coordination Center on the mainland. "Coast Guard Rescue Coordination, this is Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell at Naval Training Facility Bravo," she transmitted. "We have 35 personnel in emergency bunker shelter requiring evacuation assistance when weather conditions permit. We have injured personnel requiring medical attention." The response came back immediately, clear and professional. "Lieutenant Mitchell, this is Coast Guard Rescue. We have been trying to contact your facility for over 12 hours. Confirm your status and location." For the next hour, Sarah provided detailed information about their situation, the condition of the base, the extent of the flooding, and the medical needs of the people in the bunker. The Coast Guard coordinator explained that rescue operations were already being planned for multiple locations in the area, but weather conditions were still too dangerous for helicopter operations. "We're tracking the storm's movement," the coordinator explained. "Hurricane Delilah should move far enough offshore within the next 6 hours to allow rescue flights. Can you maintain your current situation until then?" "Affirmative," Sarah replied. "We have restored life support and adequate supplies. We can maintain this status indefinitely if necessary." As word spread through the bunker that rescue was coming, the mood changed dramatically. People who had been quiet and worried began talking and even laughing. The children started playing games with some of the younger service members. The elderly woman, who had been barely conscious when Sarah found her, was now sitting up and sharing stories about surviving the 1935 Labor Day hurricane in the Florida Keys. But Sarah knew that their challenges weren't over. Getting rescue helicopters to the base was only the first step. The people in the bunker would need to get from their underground shelter to a location where they could be safely evacuated, and the surface conditions were still extremely dangerous. Chief Kane had been thinking about the same problem. "We're going to need to survey the surface conditions before the rescue teams arrive," he told Sarah. "They'll need to know where they can safely land and what obstacles they're going to face." "I'll go," Sarah volunteered immediately. Kane shook his head. "You've done enough. Besides, the Admiral wants you to stay on communications duty until the evacuation is complete." But Sarah felt responsible for the success of the entire operation. She had started this mission by volunteering to restore communications, and she wanted to see it through to the end. "Chief, I know the surface conditions better than anyone else here. I know where the safe areas are and where the major obstacles are located." Admiral Richardson, who had been listening to their conversation, made the decision. "Mitchell, you'll conduct the surface survey with Chief Kane and 2 volunteers. But this is a reconnaissance mission only, no unnecessary risks. We need information, not heroes." 2 hours before the scheduled arrival of the rescue helicopters, Sarah found herself preparing to venture onto the surface for the 3rd time since the hurricane began. The storm had finally moved far enough away that the winds had dropped to manageable levels, but the flooding remained extensive, and the landscape was still littered with dangerous debris. The reconnaissance team consisted of Sarah, Chief Kane, Petty Officer Rodriguez, who had recovered enough from his electrical injuries to be mobile, and Hospital Corpsman Lisa Chong, who could assess any medical emergencies they might encounter on the surface. Emerging from the bunker into daylight revealed the full extent of Hurricane Delilah's destruction. The naval training facility had been essentially erased from the landscape. Buildings that had housed hundreds of people were gone completely. Others had been reduced to scattered piles of concrete and twisted metal. The carefully maintained grounds looked like a moonscape, with the storm surge having scoured away not just buildings but trees, roads, and even some of the underlying soil. The flooding had receded somewhat, but large areas of the base were still underwater. What struck Sarah most powerfully was the silence. There were no birds, no insects, no sounds of normal life. The hurricane had created a temporary dead zone where nothing moved except the gentle lapping of flood water against debris. "Jesus," Rodriguez whispered, looking around at the devastation. "It's like a nuclear bomb went off." The communications building where Sarah had restored power was still standing, though it looked like it had taken additional damage during the second half of the storm. The bunker complex appeared to be structurally sound, which was reassuring for future operations. The team spent an hour identifying potential landing zones for the rescue helicopters. The main helicopter pad had been completely destroyed, but there was a large parking area about 300 yards from the bunker that appeared to be solid and relatively clear of debris. Getting the evacuees from the bunker to that landing zone would require wading through chest-deep water in some areas, but it was manageable. As they were completing their survey, Sarah heard the distinctive sound of helicopter rotor blades in the distance. The rescue operation was beginning, and she felt a surge of pride and relief that she had played a crucial role in making it possible. The first helicopter to arrive was a Coast Guard HH-60 Jayhawk, painted in the distinctive red and white colors that meant salvation to people in distress. Sarah guided the aircraft to the improvised landing zone using hand signals and radio communication, then coordinated the evacuation of the most seriously injured people first. Mark Reynolds, the contractor with the injured leg, was one of the first to be loaded aboard the helicopter. As the medical team prepared him for transport, he grabbed Sarah's hand. "Thank you," he said simply. "My family owes you their lives." Sarah squeezed his hand in return. "Just get that leg fixed so you can get back to work." The evacuation process took nearly 4 hours, with multiple helicopter flights required to transport all 35 people to safety on the mainland. Sarah remained on the surface throughout the operation, coordinating between the rescue teams and the people in the bunker, ensuring that everyone was accounted for and that no one was left behind. She was among the last to be evacuated, along with Admiral Richardson and Chief Kane. As the final helicopter lifted off from the devastated base, Sarah looked down at the scene of destruction and felt a complex mixture of emotions. The hurricane had been terrifying and destructive, but it had also been transformative in ways she was still trying to understand. At the mainland emergency shelter, Sarah was reunited with her fellow SEAL candidates who had been evacuated before the storm. They looked at her with a mixture of awe and respect that she had never experienced before. Word had already spread about her actions during the hurricane, and she found herself uncomfortable with the attention. "I heard you went outside during a Category 5 hurricane," said Tom Bradley, one of the other candidates. "That's either really brave or really crazy." "Probably both," Sarah admitted. Chief Kane overheard the conversation and joined them. "What Mitchell did out there wasn't just brave," he said. "It was smart, well-planned, and executed with exactly the kind of judgment we want to see in special operations personnel." Later that evening, as Sarah sat in the emergency shelter writing her official report of the incident, Admiral Richardson approached her with news that would change her life. "Lieutenant," he said, "I've been in contact with Special Operations Command about your performance during the hurricane. Based on your actions over the past 36 hours, you're being fast-tracked through the remaining phases of SEAL training." Sarah looked up from her report, not sure she had heard correctly. "Sir, you've already demonstrated every quality we look for in a Navy SEAL," the Admiral explained. "Leadership under extreme pressure, technical competence, physical courage, sound judgment, and the ability to adapt to rapidly changing circumstances. The hurricane was a better test of those qualities than anything we could have designed in a training environment." 3 months later, Sarah Mitchell became the first woman to graduate from SEAL training at that particular facility. Her instructors noted in their final evaluation that she had shown exceptional leadership potential and recommended her for advanced special operations training. But Sarah always remembered that her real test hadn't taken place in a training facility or a classroom. It had happened during the longest night of her life, when Hurricane Delilah had tried to destroy everything in its path, and she had walked straight into the storm to save the lives of 35 people. Years later, when Sarah had become a decorated special operations officer leading missions around the world, people would sometimes ask her about that night. They wanted to know how she had found the courage to venture out into a Category 5 hurricane, how she had managed to save so many lives, how she had proven that she belonged in one of the military's most elite units. Sarah's answer was always the same. "I didn't prove anything that night. I just did what needed to be done, one step at a time, until everyone was safe. The whispered doubts of she didn't make it had become a story of triumph. But Sarah Mitchell knew that the real victory wasn't in proving her critics wrong. It was in proving to herself that when everything goes wrong, you can still choose to do what's right. The storm had tested her, but she had walked out of it alive, bringing everyone else with her. And that, she had learned, was what being a SEAL really meant. Making sure that everyone comes home, no matter what it takes to make that happen. In the end, Hurricane Delilah hadn't broken her. It had forged her into exactly the kind of leader the military needed. Someone who could face impossible odds and find a way to win. The storm had whispered that she wouldn't make it, but Sarah Mitchell had written her own ending to that story. She had walked out of the storm alive, and she had never looked back.